Hi, everyone. I see we've got some people filtering in. As you come on in, feel free to drop a line in the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. I'm tuning in from Minneapolis and Sara is tuning in from Green Bay today. We've got somebody else coming in from Minneapolis. We had pretty big registration for this webinar today, so I'm going to give everyone just a couple minutes longer than normal to tune in. Ah, Chicago. Somebody from out of the state. If you excuse me, I actually need to redo my screen sharing here so that I can see all the windows I need to see. So give me just a minute. I see we also have somebody else calling in from Wisconsin. Welcome, everybody. There we go. As I'm sure many of you are familiar, once you share your screen on Zoom, you lose all of your notes. So you have to do some shuffling to make sure that they're all still there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you all for tuning in today. We're very excited to have Sara Smith joining us today. And she is actually the recipient of this year's Individual Adaptation Award. And we'll actually be having multiple presentations throughout the year from a variety of our award recipients. So pay attention for those, especially if you're subscribed to our email list. If not, I will include that link also at the end of the webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. Just first, I'll introduce the speaker, and then I'll go over a couple of housekeeping notes, and then Sara will give a presentation that's about 40 minutes long, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So Sara is a citizen of the United Nation of Wisconsin and is the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison with the College of Menominee Nation Sustainable Development Institute, in association with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. As the liaison for the Midwest, she works on facilitating stronger relationships between tribes, climate researchers, organizations, academic institutions, and the Midwest CASC, or Climate Adaptation Science Center. In addition, she works with tribes to build capacity and provide support by helping identify gaps and assisting with climate resilience efforts. Sara holds a Master of Science in Ecology from the State University of New York, College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and an undergraduate degree in biology and First Nation studies from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. A couple of friendly reminders about how our particular webinar works. So we will end promptly at 1 p.m. and we will keep all of you muted throughout the presentation, but you are welcome to submit questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we will record the webinar and post it to MCAP's YouTube channel within the week. Couple of friendly reminders. We've all been using Zoom for quite some time now, but it's helpful to have a refresher. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom in order to submit your questions, and you can do that at any point during the presentation. And also you can upvote other people's questions that you find particularly interesting. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass the microphone over to Sara. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Segus Fabagu, Sara Smith Yungiats, Oniote Aga Nai, Kale Wagwaho Niwagadaloda. Hello, everyone. My name is Sara Smith, and like was mentioned, I'm a citizen of the United Nations, and I'm Wolf Clan. And so today I'm here to talk about the work that I do. As an individual awardee, I was really appreciative of that nomination and the award. And so I want to thank those who nominated me and for the awards committee, because I'm very grateful that that happened. So where I'm to take you on a journey. So my position is funded through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but I'm employed through the College of Menominee Nations Sustainable Development Institute, which is in Wisconsin. And then I am associated with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center that now is hosted by the University of Minnesota Twin Cities on the St. Paul campus. And so a little bit about me before I get into what I do. I feel like a roadmap is always good to see how one has gotten to where they are. So I did start out at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. And part of my journey was figuring out what I wanted to do. And it turned out I was really enchanted by forests and ecology, and combining that with the First Nations Studies program that they had, which was really unique at the time. So I double majored in those, which actually led me to my opportunity at SUNY ESF in New York, studying ectomycorrhizal fungi with the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. So that was really great. And I wanted to provide a map so you all know where I'm talking about. So when I say I'm from the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, if you can see, there's a little kind of rectangle on an axis. So that's where the Oneida Nation is. And I grew up just south of the reservation in Appleton. And then when I was doing my research for my graduate career, I studied with the Menominee Nation, so just north of us, northwest. And then after that, I worked with the Stockbridge-Muncie community, so right next to Menominee, for about a year as an environmental technician. And that really led me to the position I'm in today, which is the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison. And so my position, I cover the entire Midwest region, which is quite large. But I specifically work with the 35 federally recognized tribes in the Midwest, which primarily reside in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa. We do have state recognized tribes in the Midwest and also non-recognized tribes as well. And so I want to mention that too, because even though maybe a lot of us are familiar with those who are federally recognized, there are those who are still in their traditional territories that are not recognized either federally or by the state that they reside in. And so part of my job is to help cultivate awareness of climate threats to cultural and natural resources in tribal communities, and to promote tools of resilience for adaptation planning. And so by doing this, I help to identify the gaps, as well as improving outreach and education within these tribal communities and helping build tribal capacity. And so I really act as this nexus to foster information exchange among partners such as the CASC, so the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, the BIA, tribal communities, tribal organizations, institutions, and many other partners. And so the Midwest cask is actually the newest cask of them all, which is really great. We were part of the Northeast, and we recently got our own region. So this is what our consortium looks like. It's made up of universities, the College of Menominee Nation, so a tribal college, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and also the Nature Conservancy. So we have a wide variety of partners that are part of this consortium. And the cask itself, its headquarters are at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And so, like I said, the Midwest is my service area. There are other tribal liaisons as well in the different service areas you see here, as well as Alaska. I wasn't able to fit it on the screen, but each region has at least one liaison. And recently, we were awarded more funding to bring on additional liaisons. So in our region, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, we have funding to bring on a deputy liaison. And for example, Alaska also has received enough funding to support 4 total liaisons in that region, which is really great because of the size of Alaska and the different needs of Alaskan Native tribes and villages. So as the resilience liaison, I wear multiple hats. And one of the reasons why we have increased our funding to add additional liaisons or assistant liaisons and deputies is to help with the work that we've started. And so some of the work that I do a lot of networking through conferences and workshops within the Midwest and nationally. So last week I was down actually in Miami with the Miccosukee tribe who hosted the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society conference. I do a lot of tribal visits across the Midwest. This is something I started to do right away back in 2017. When I started this position, it kind of went on hiatus at the end of 2019 when the COVID outbreak happened. But this week, actually, I am restarting up tribal visits, which is amazing. These are really important to build relationships. And during the pandemic, I've noticed a lot that we've, adapted to Zoom and other platforms, but it's just not the same as being in person and building that relationship with those folks and the communities as well. And so another part of my work is also with the Northeast Indigenous Climate Resilience Network and working closely with the advisory council that we have. So this network was set up back when we were part of the larger Northeast region. And so myself and my counterpart in the Northeast, we both work with this network and our advisory council, which is made up of Indigenous scholars, managers, and elders across the Northeast region. And it's meant to be somewhat of a clearinghouse where you can find tools and resources, partners, things like that. And I'll share a little bit more later on that as well. I also worked collaboratively to create the tribal adaptation menu, which I think a lot of you have seen, maybe one of our webinars or been to one of our workshops. I also provide technical assistance to tribes on tribal projects and plans. So adaptation planning, hazard mitigation, I've recently been assisting with in partnership with FEMA. I'm also involved in a lot of Menominee projects and groups within the Midwest. So wild rice is one of the beans or species that are really being impacted in tribal communities and in the Midwest in general. And it's a very significant being to the tribes. So I've been trying to do a lot more involvement with those. And then just building partnerships and relationships with partners and tribes and networks across the region. And then another avenue that's done is also through events. So we also hosted our 2021 Shifting Season Summit last year in April, which was really great. And it was meant to bring folks together, sharing adaptation and resilience knowledge within and across Indigenous communities. So we don't have to keep recreating the wheel for projects that we're working on. So like I said, a big part of my job when I first started and now starting up again is tribal visits. So these visits are really important to build relationships with the tribes and also understanding where gaps are in research, what their needs are and interests, and how I can best serve them to find them the resources and partners that are needed. So in Minnesota, in Wisconsin and Michigan, I've done about 15 tribal visits, and they are all very different. It really depends on what the community is looking for and if we are able to align those visits up with community events, which are really important as well. So for example, I visited with the Lactive Lambo Band, and they were working on at the time this multifaceted resilience strategy, looking at doing, their vulnerability assessment, adaptation plan, hazard mitigation plan, and energy reduction plan all into one. And it was quite fabulous to see this work being done and the types of partners that they included. So like, it wasn't just natural resource staff, but it was also, people from the health field, infrastructure. It was a wide variety of partners, which makes these plans very strong when you have very diverse partners within the tribal community coming together to put these plans together. And then with the Fond du Lac Band, I was actually able to pair the visit with one of their youth camps that they have, which was really cool because the youth are very knowledgeable as well. So talking to them, their youth camp, I think that year they had, the youngest was about 4, if I'm remembering correctly, all the way up to college level. So it was really wonderful to pair it with that because I'm not just meeting with natural resource managers then, I'm meeting with the community, with the youth, and really understanding what their needs and concerns are in regards to climate change. And so with all of that, I'm going to briefly go through some climate impacts to tribal nations. So those working in the climate realm, this won't be new to you, but I did want to share some of the impacts that they're seeing. So temperature is a really big one. So we're seeing an increase in temperature overall in the Midwest region, and also, an increase in frost-free days, which, so when I'm working in tribal communities, it's not all negative, right? So frost-free season increases may mean more agricultural days, things like that. But temperature is a really big impact for many other aspects as well that I'll touch on in the next few slides. So temperature is obviously impacting our snow and ice in the Great Lakes, which, is part of our identity. So on the left, from the Wang et al. Paper in 2012, we've seen a decrease of about 71% in lake ice on our Great Lakes overall since the 1970s up to 2010. So I don't have the most recent data, but it's a huge decrease from where it used to be, which is really impactful to our ecosystems and also our cultural traditions that we have in tribal communities, and also for those who, like to do ice fishing or skating. or things along those sorts as well. So that's why I included the image on the right. It's from the Knoll et al. Paper in 2019 about how ice-covered inland waters are really important to our communities overall, whether that's socially, subsistence, ceremonial, artistic. Ice and snow are really important to us in the Midwest as who we are as people. Precipitation is also having a big impact in our region as well. So heavy precipitation events are increasing in our region, which tribal communities are being hit really hard. So the image on the right is from 2016 from the big rain event we had up by the Bad River Reservation in Wisconsin. I actually drove through this storm. Do not recommend. But we didn't realize how bad of an event this was going to be. And the toll it took on the community and infrastructure and water quality and wildlife. And then once again, another storm hit the area in 2018 as well. And they weren't ready for it to happen once again 2 years later. So we're seeing these intense precipitation days. And so part of my job is to figure out, how best can we make these tribal communities resilient, and what do they need? Do they need the data? Do they need the scientists? Do they need the funding? And usually it's a combination of all of that. Fish and wildlife are also being impacted. Our lakes are warming, our rivers are warming, so that's impacting species that are important to tribes like brook trout, walleye, sturgeon, and then other beings as well, like snowshoe hare, an increased camouflage mismatch in the season due to, decreased snow duration and things like that. So they're getting preyed upon more. Impacts to moose is also a big concern in our region as well to tribes. And then our forests are also changing. Unlike the forest that might be shifting and the beings and species that are going with them, tribes are stuck on reservations and ceded territories. And so these beings might be moving, but we cannot move with them. And that means we cannot bring our ceremonies and traditions, with them as well. And so this is really impacting for, our culture, our stories, just our identity as people. So for example, sugar maple is really important. And with sugar maple, they are projected to possibly, move farther north. So that means, possibly tribal engagement and coordination between those in the lower 48 and First Nations up in Canada to perhaps keep those traditions and ceremonies alive. So how are tribes adapting and becoming more resilient? So one of the things I think about when I do the work that I do is the Menominee theoretical model of sustainability. And so I provided a link to the article as well as the site for those who are interested in reading more about it. So when I go into this work and I think about, helping with putting plans together and vulnerability assessments, I really think about these different areas and how they interact with each other, because they're not all separate, right? And so we want to look holistically at how can we make our communities more resilient to climate change. So one way is to start with vulnerability assessments. So it's really, IDing key beings and their vulnerability to climate change, identifying the different categories, so plants, fish, wildlife, amphibians, whatever these communities see as important. It could also be air quality, health, wetlands in general. And so my job is to help identify experts and data needs And so community members and elders are really important in this because they are experts as well. Scientists, maybe institutions that can help them with their data needs as well. And then this influences their adaptation and hazard mitigation plans as well. So on the right, I just provided two examples of vulnerability assessments. The top one is from GlyphWix, so the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and the bottom one is from the 1854 Treaty Authority, which is in northern Minnesota. And so a lot of times these work in tandem with, or being done in tandem with their vulnerability assessments. And so it's really to identify adaptation and mitigation strategies for all these beings and hazards that were considered in the vulnerability assessment, and including that climate data and considerations. And so these plans look very different. So for example, 1854, they put their vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan all into one. For the Akwesasne Nation over in New York, they set theirs up unique that follows our Thanksgiving address. So it goes from the people, Mother Earth, all the way up to the creator on how these sectors are being impacted by climate change and what adaptation tools and plans are in place for them. Another way I help with planning projects and vulnerability assessments and plans is through the tribal adaptation menu and the workshops we put on as a team. So we've had 5 so far, starting back in 2019. We actually have one coming up in June, so it's just a month away. And that one's specifically focused on wild rice. And so these 5 previous workshops are assisted with NIAX, so the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and we follow their adaptation workbook process. So a lot of these people bring projects to the workshops, and we use the tribal adaptation menu to assist with their projects. So it could be tribes bringing projects, non-tribal partners who are working with tribes and how to do that more effectively and respectfully. So in the menu, we provide guiding principles on how that can be done. And it's written from a Midwestern perspective because that's where the authors are from. But we've made it in a way that can be adaptable to other regions. So we've had projects dealing with like sea level rise, which is something we don't deal with here, but it is adaptable enough to work with those communities that aren't in the Midwest. And we're also in the midst of working with a tribal community in the East to adapt this menu to their culture and their language and values. So some of the tools and resources, I've mentioned a few of these. It's really going to depend for those in tribal communities and for those working with tribes or want to work with tribes. So it really depends on that, and then scale as well. If you're looking at all of Minnesota to work with all those tribal nations, or maybe it's just the 1854 ceded territory. It really depends, but there are a lot of funding options for tribes and for non-tribal partners. We have one of the big ones I help with is the BIA Tribal Climate Resilience Program, which includes adaptation and implementation funding, which is really great. And so I help with tribes, if they need to write up the RFP, I help with those as well. Like I mentioned, I work with our FEMA region liaison as well for any hazard mitigation needs that the tribes are asking for. There's also the Tribal Climate Change Guide, which helps as well. And so I mentioned the Tribal Climate Adaptation menu. If you're interested, I provided a link as well. There's also the Tribal Climate Adaptation Guidebook, and version 2 is coming out soon, which I'm very excited about. And then there's another resource too for thinking about, community-driven resilience, and a framework that helps with that, which is geared a bit more towards cities and municipalities, and how to work with tribes as well. Like I said, I help manage the Northeast Indigenous Climate Resilience Network as well, and I provided a link for that. The one caveat for that one is our website is unfortunately down at the moment, but please keep checking back for the network. It should be up and running soon, within a week or so is my hope. But this is a really great site for those working with tribes or want to work with tribes, and understanding some of the impacts, and ways to start dialogues and things like that. And then my special announcement I wanted to include as well. So like I mentioned, the BIA was able to get funding for more liaisons. And so we have our Deputy Tribal Climate Resilience Liaison posting, which is currently open. So I am currently located in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I was located in the Twin Cities, but during the pandemic, I moved back home. And so this position will actually be located at University of Minnesota Twin Cities at the Climate Adaptation Science Center. So if you know anybody who is interested in working with tribes, please send the link around. We are hoping to keep it open until the end of the month, maybe mid-June, depending on our applicants. So yeah, this is really exciting, and I'm looking forward to having more help with the work I do. So I want to say, Yongo, thank you for inviting me to speak today, as well as with the individual award. Like I said, I'm very grateful for this, and I am open to questions if you have them.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'm going to chime back in here and help us get some questions going. Reminder to everybody that you can submit questions via the Q&A feature. I know that there were many links that I just dropped into the chat for all of you. So we will send out an email tomorrow following up for those of you who have registered for the webinar that will contain that information. So that should be then easier for you to access all this information on your own time. So I actually had a question to go ahead and get us started. You made a really good point about the fact that with climate change, we're going to start to see some of these species moving, but that tribes are not as flexible in where they can move because they're bound to the land that has been organized via treaties. And so I wonder how you envision that people will adapt to this challenge. It provides a lot of cultural and also sustenance challenges. And what do you think the future looks like in maybe 50 years or so if some of those species have moved out of the traditional lands?
Yeah, so just from the work that I've been doing and talking with tribes, it really depends on the communities. So, some of our tribal nations are towards the lower part of the Midwest, well, the lower part of the upper Midwest. And so they're dealing with these species migrations a lot more than maybe the northern tribes are. But it really depends on what their community values are and what they would like to see. So I know some tribes are working on assisted migration of species that are projected to be in their region to help transition go a bit more smoothly. But that also means communication with those where those species are coming from and how they're used, and the culture tied to them. And then working with our partners in the North, so First Nations, for those closer to the border, on, maybe keeping traditions alive going across the border, or just a lot of collaborating, because these species don't know political boundaries. They're just lines on a map for them. And so it's impacting our communities in that way, because they don't see these political boundaries like we do on a map. So yeah, it just really depends on the community. Some are being hit hard from emerald ash borer and have lost all their black ash, which impacts basket making. And with that, some communities are preserving black ash seeds, submerging them in water, or trying to transition to other species. So it's really diverse, the different adaptation strategies that tribes are doing, but it's tied to what their specific community values are, and their needs. So there's not a one size fits all for them. Yeah.
Of course, I think there's not really a one size fits all for anybody. I think that's why it's so important to create these tools that people can adapt to their individual situations or their specific community's situation. We had a question from Diana about resilience planning. Wanted to know if it includes anything about vehicle electrification, considering the reduction of air pollution from a transition away from gas-powered vehicles.
Yeah, there probably is, but not that I'm aware of. I know at the College of Menominee Nation, we just got a solar powered golf carts to help reduce emissions, and we're looking into different ways to offset those. I know some tribes are tracking their CO2 emissions, electricity, things like that, trying to do more solar power. For those in Minnesota, I have a great person, if you're interested in tribal solar power, to talk to. His name is Rob Blake. He does a lot of work with tribal solar, which is really great. So I think there is, just not with the work that I'm doing currently. Yep, Bob Blake is great.
So we also have a question now from Kristen. She asks, are you hearing that most Midwest tribes have a staff person who is dedicated to climate resilience work? Are these new positions or are they housed with other work? And which departments do they typically work under?
Yeah, so from what I've been seeing, yes, there have been more positions that are specifically like a climate change coordinator. And they've found dedicated funding to go towards that. So it really depends on that part too. There are some that just wear multiple hats and climate change is just part of their position, which makes it really hard when you're talking about capacity, because they have other issues to deal with too. Most of the time they work under natural resources or environmental departments, which is where they're typically housed. But yeah, it really depends on if the tribe can get dedicated funding for a climate coordinator position. And if not, what positions are already there that can work on the climate change aspect. So I know, our tribal resilience funding through the BIA helps with some of that, but they don't provide permanent funding for positions. So it's always a difficult thing when funding is involved and making sure it's consistent funding for over the years.
I definitely understand that struggle. As someone who's soft funded myself, quote unquote, soft funded means that it comes through grants. So does most of the funding for these kinds of positions come from grants, or do you find, okay, yeah.
Yep, for the most part, they're grant funded. I've been trying to find like private funding from maybe corporations, things like that, or like foundations that might have funding to help as well. But those are a little bit harder to get into. So it's mainly grant funded.
Understandable. We had another question pop up. Barb asks, how have local non-tribal governments helped with adaptation and mitigation?
That's a good question. It really depends on the area. So I can't speak to all tribes, because, based on their location and things like that. Um, with our travel adaptation menu workshops, we have gotten some like state or municipality workers that are trying to work in their areas where tribes specifically, they're not there, but it's ceded territory. And so trying to work with them on any projects that they're doing in regards to adaptation or mitigation. I know the Park Service up, what is it, the Apostle Islands in Wisconsin, they've been working really closely with tribes for efforts up there, which include like reintroduction of fire. So some things take they take time to build these relationships. I know the Forest Service, they've been trying to work really hard for those who are close to national forests. So like White Earth and Red Lake in Minnesota, and others too. So it really just depends. And it also depends on if these, if it's city or county, if they have the capacity as well. It's always really important to make sure that, tribes and other communities that are being impacted are brought to the table right away and not while like adaptation efforts are underway and things like that. So because you get some really good insight into what's happening at the community level and things like that. So yeah, they've just helped in different ways. If they have funding to support tribes, that's always great too. In regards to adaptation, if they're co-sharing or co-managing an area. So it really just depends. A lot of this is, it really just depends on the tribes and if the governments are willing to work with tribes and what their relationships look like and things like that.
You actually touched on something that I had written down as a question. And so I wonder if you can provide some advice for people who work in the field of resilience and adaptation in particular. How do you recommend that they engage tribal communities as partners from the beginning, rather than coming as, give us your consultation 4 years into a project?
Yeah, so if you are, thinking about a project, that's when to bring tribes in, is when you start to think about it, before you write up a grant proposal or things like that. So it's never too early to include tribes and other communities that are being impacted. In terms of how to go about that, the Midwest has a variety of tribes, so they're all unique, and when you're trying to build relationships, you want to make sure it's early, you want to make sure it's respectful, and so it's really so for how I see it, you want to ask these communities to, you want to visit with them, like I do, and get to know them on a personal level. And, it's also making sure their concerns are included. So a lot of times, and I've seen this before, there'll be tribal consultation. The tribes will state their concerns, but then they get overlooked a lot of the time. So making sure you're very transparent in what you're trying to do with tribes. But yeah, it's just building those relationships. So like, even if you're not thinking about a project right now, just start building those relationships. So it could be with the natural resources department if you're in that arena, could be with health services if you're looking at more of that health aspect. It's also important to touch base with their tribal historic preservation officers as well. If you want to learn more about the community and their culture, that's always really important. Not just, visiting and building relationships, but understanding their culture too. So like I said, I'm a citizen of the Oneida Nation. So like I've done, my background with Menominee and Ojibwe and Dakota tribes, and like those they're unique tribes and what they've gone through. And it's a long process, but it's really beneficial. And I feel like a lot of the resilience being done in communities that include Indigenous, concerns and representation. I feel like those projects, I don't know, bear a lot of fruit. I'll put it that way. So.
Well, and absolutely that Indigenous communities have knowledge about the land that goes way further back and way deeper than maybe some of their other counterparts. So I can imagine bringing in all those different kinds of knowledge and all those perspectives is going to give you a much more robust solution that works for everybody and is probably longer lasting. So you have another question. This one is from Jeff. He says, thanks, Sarah, for your presentation. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or comments about the connections between climate adaptation and food sovereignty within tribal communities, maybe even how infrastructure improvements and funding play a role. Any examples of where that work is currently happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I talked earlier about the model for sustainability, I really think about those different sectors, right? So natural resources, food sovereignty, infrastructure, because they're all being impacted by climate change. So there are a lot of efforts being done, connecting those things together, whether it's like a hazard mitigation plan or a food sovereignty initiative that the tribe is doing. A lot of them are including climate data and climate recommendations on how to go about things. Infrastructure is a huge thing. FEMA mainly works with the tribes on that. But I've seen a lot of the impacts climate has had on them firsthand, with the storms I showed earlier, resizing culverts because of high precipitation events. So yeah, a lot of these plans that tribes have are starting to include climate change, which is really great. And so they're happening all over the place. The level at which they're at it always varies. Some have worked years in food sovereignty initiatives, others are just getting started. And then with the workshops we've done, we've had projects dealing with food sovereignty, which has been really great. How to include the climate data in that kind of work. So yeah, they're happening all over in the tribal communities, and also in urban population areas where tribes are. That's also a really important thing to making sure those communities, like in cities, are also being resilient as well in the initiatives. So
I've actually noticed that. Yeah, it's a great question. And I've noticed that we have tribal communities here in Minneapolis as well. There's a cultural center. I don't remember the cross streets, and it's probably not important to most of our listeners, but I drive past that cultural center and it's not what you expect. But of course, there's, people are all over the place. And so you have to consider those people as well.
Yeah, there's a big one up in Duluth as well that I was able to visit. It has a really awesome painting on one of the walls outside. But yeah, they're really important to think about too, because a lot of times, a lot of tribal members have moved to cities for, jobs and things like that. But yeah, just trying to remember those urban populations that are outside of their territories and outside of their reservations, and making sure they're doing good as well.
How are those communities, this is not just my curiosity question, how are those communities incorporated with the communities that are on the reservations? Is there any sort of, I'm sure it varies from tribe to tribe, but is there any sort of formal structure that they are involved in what's happening on the reservation?
I'm not sure, to be honest. Yeah.
Just a curiosity.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but that's a good question.
So we have another question from Kristen, and she asks, can you talk more about 7-generation sustainability? What are the conversations around planning when it is so difficult to predict what our climate will be like in that timeline?
Yeah, great question. So that's something we also thought about when we were writing the tribal adaptation menu, and how our work is going to be impacting 7 generations down the line. And a lot of the tribal communities, if not all of them, are thinking that way too. And so, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to predicting climate in that timeline. But it's also thinking back 7 generations as well, to help with tribal resiliency. So that could look like picking the language back up, picking up ceremonies, traditions. So it's also going back and reclaiming those that we've lost to help with future resilience. And so a lot of these climate plans are, staged within maybe 5 to 10 years, that they get updated frequently. Um, but a lot of the strategies that tribes are working on is just, how, if we restore this wetland, so it can, sustain wild rice again, how will that impact 7 generations down the line? Will it be beneficial for that purpose? But there's a lot of different adaptation strategies too, where tribes might just want to see what happens to the landscape, instead of actively managing it. So yeah, it's really interesting, working with tribes and what they're thinking 7 generations wise, in their planning process, even though funding is, only for 2 to 5 years or something like that, but making small steps where it'll be beneficial further down the line. But yeah, it is very difficult to do that kind of thinking with such uncertainty with climate change.
Right, because I think of 7 generations, let's say a generation is about 25 years, then you're looking at more than 100 years into the future. And even our best climate models by 2100, they start to go in all sorts of different directions. So that's a really challenging question for sure.
Yeah, and I think one really great strategy tribes have been doing, not just like reclaiming language and stuff like that, is but having youth camps. So getting them back out on the landscape, in addition to the language that comes with it and the traditions. But having camps like that, I've seen have been really beneficial to reconnect the children to the environment. Especially, in today's age where, we have a lot of screens. I see that with my family too. But trying to get them back out on the landscape, whether that's ice fishing or skiing or hunting, like those are all so beneficial, even if it's just a tiny step forward.
And do you think that that helps particularly young people once they feel that connection to the land again, it helps them want to care for it more?
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
Because with the work I do, it's, you see, those ads about the polar bears and things like that and how they're being effective. But with this work and with trying to get communities on board with these initiatives, how is it impacting them? So we talk, about sugar maple, like the shorter season for sugar maple, for sap, how that's being impacted for tribal members who gather, but who also rely on it for economic purposes. How are the fish? Like we're seeing rises in lake and river temperatures. So traditional fish species are going away. So it's really, tying into them personally, how it's affecting them. And that it's actually happening on the landscape. And I know for me, like I haven't been on this planet for very long, but I've noticed a lot of changes just in my short time here. So kids today are even seeing it that are younger, that they're noticing differences like loss of winter and things like that. So yeah, like I remember we barely had any snow days like when I was in high school compared to when I was a kid. My nephew, I don't think he's ever seen a snow day. They just don't happen anymore. So I mean, we get cold days, but that's a whole other story.
So I have one last question for you to close us out before we sign off at 1. And that is, I'm going to ask you maybe to brag a little bit, which I know is not necessarily the comfort zone for a lot of people in the Midwest. But what do you think other people who are trying to work on adaptation and resilience, what do they have to learn from the work that you've done in your position?
That's a big question. For one thing, I would say just to have hope. And I know when we're working in the climate realm, a lot of things are negative, right? And so I see that a lot, but making sure like we're bringing hope to the table, that the work we're doing, we might not get back to where we were, but that we're making it a better place for 7 generations down the line. Not in the same way our ancestors have seen, but in a way that will be beautiful for them. So yeah, just having that hope is really important when doing the climate resilience work. And yeah, if you want to work with tribes, start those relationships early. Relationships are everything, and just be transparent. And yeah, and I have my contact available, if you want to talk more. But it's really also just doing your research to where you are, and what tribes are there, what tribes were there. So yeah, those kinds of things I would say. But hope is a really big one, for getting us to continue to do our work.
I love that. Thank you. That's not what I expected, but it's so inspiring. So thank you so much. Well, we are just before 1 o'clock, everybody. So I just want to bring your attention to the fact that I dropped a few more links in the chat. If you have a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey, we would really appreciate it. And that lets us know how we're doing, if we're providing content that's interesting to you, and whether you have suggestions for future webinars. You can also subscribe to our email list. And I've dropped the link for MCAP's YouTube channel. Within the week, we will have the webinar up on our channel with subtitles. So one more thank you to you, Sara, for joining us today. This has been a great conversation and an interesting presentation. And I know that it's been really useful for everyone who has tuned in.
Thank you for having me.
All right, have a good day, everybody. Thank you.